Hello and welcome to the New Thought Men's Podcast, where we explore what it is to be a healthy spiritual man today. I'm Eamon. It's great to have you with us. Welcome, everyone, to the New Thought Men's Podcast. I am Eamon. Today, I am here with Asa Henderson, a dear friend of mine and a brother of many years. It's great to have you with us today, Asa. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Eamon. It's so nice to be here.
Before we get started, I want to share a little bit about you so people get to know you a little bit. So Asa has been involved in men's work for over 20 years. We were in a men's group for a good portion of that together. He co-founded Journey to Manhood Online, a digital resource for young men finding meaning and purpose in life. He is the former Youth Council Coordinator for the Men's Leadership Alliance and has facilitated rites of passages and other programs for boys and young men from the age of 9 to 24. He is also an avid lifelong student of philosophy with a recent focus in environmental ethics and a climate solutions nerd. I love it.
Yeah.
If we should all be that nerd.
Yeah,
right?
it's really actually so encouraging to follow solutions. Because there's so many brilliant people out there who are working and applying their intelligence to creating the solutions to these problems. And every day there's new things being created or implemented. And so it's really valuable to kind of like keep that in mind while we also hear about the doom and gloom of what could happen if we don't, deal with these things.
Absolutely. This is the big thing, and
defining challenge of our times, you could say.
The challenge of our times, indeed. And we talked a little bit about that, but before we get into that piece of it, I think I'd like to start with sort of what you started with your sharing for the New Thought Men Summit, and that's virtue ethics. So let's kind of start there. What is virtue ethics, and how does it really help us?
So yeah, I think virtue ethics is a really valuable approach to thinking about life. I wasn't raised religious, but I know you were, and I think a lot of times when we think about ethics and morality in our culture, we tend to think about like sin and, am I doing something good or bad? And am I good or bad? Or evil? And there's a lot of shame involved, and it's kind of like, or this idea of temptation, and virtue ethics is kind of a theory of ethics that was really like all of the major Greek philosophers were virtue ethicists of some sort, or at least most of them. I don't like to make sweeping statements like that, but Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, the Cynics, and it basically is this idea that there are certain things that are good for human beings, that and that there's certain qualities that we can kind of cultivate within ourselves that make us that are constitutive of a flourishing life, of a full life, of a good human life. What is a good human life, and how do you go about living that? So it doesn't require this sort of like lawgiver God who's like, do this, don't do that. And some people don't believe in that kind of God. And then it's like, well, where does right and wrong come from if there's no God saying like, do this, don't do that? But virtue ethics is kind of based in what does it mean to be a human being? Like, what is our nature and what makes for a good human life versus a less flourishing human life?
Mm. Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. I mean, and these were the deep thinkers. I mean, I think in some way, I mean, they have transcended time. Like, I mean, the foundational question: who am I, and what am I here for?
Yep.
This came from, you know, Aristotle and Plato and those times of this deep questioning. And I think it's time to bring some of that back, some of that deep questioning of what is it that we value. And I think uh, the virtues, when we think in terms of virtues, I know it's not interchangeable, but I think New Thought more uses values versus virtues, but similar in a lot of ways as to, you know, being that guidepost of how we choose to live our lives, and then how do we take that and assess it in our world of, yes, this is something for me, or this isn't something for me, to be able to get clarity on, is this aligned with my life? Is this aligned with my purpose? Is this aligned with who I am on a core experience and expression of life?
Yeah, so I would say maybe a way you could talk about the relationship between values and virtues is that a virtue is when you've integrated a value into your way of being in the world and
Ooh.
your character.
Mm. Okay. I like that.
Yeah.
So it's taking it to that next level of, yeah, how do I act in accordance with these values that I have in the world?
Aristotle actually tells us how to do that. And it turns out that, you know, I mean, Aristotle wasn't right about everything, but there's some things he was remarkably right about without having, you know, big double-blind studies to be able to tell him. Like, the way you develop a virtue is you build a habit. The way you become brave is by acting bravely, and the way you do that is you just make a habit of that. And a lot of people might have heard of James Clear's book Atomic Habits, but it goes into all of the research behind how that actually works. Like, that's true, that the way you develop a character trait is by starting very small. So if there's some kind of virtue you want to develop, or habit you want to develop, start with what is the tiniest little piece of that you can start doing every day. So, you know, if you want to be, or how about the virtue of self-control? That's one of the 4 cardinal virtues of the ancient Greeks. And it's one that we can all relate to. Like, you know, I tell myself I'm going to do X, but then I end up doing Y. And, you know, we can all use more discipline in our lives. So you can start with just what's one little thing that you want to, like, I end up going on social media all the time, you know, when I don't want to. So start with simple things like put your phone in the other room when you sleep, so you don't go on it in the first thing in the morning. And, or, you know, I want to exercise every day. Start with putting on your running shoes and going outside for 2 minutes, and do that every day. And then you may decide, oh, I'm already out here, I might as well run around the block, and that's fine. But the only thing you have to do is go outside for 2 minutes with your running shoes on. So it's building habits, starting small, and then eventually it becomes part of your character. You start to experience the benefits of having these qualities, because that's another part of virtue ethics, is that the virtue is what makes us happy. That true happiness and flourishing comes from creating these habits and these qualities within ourselves that you know, taking these values and bring them into our lives
and living in alignment with them.
Yeah, exactly.
Beautiful, Asa. Well, it reminds me of the you know, the Lao Tzu quote of "Watch your thoughts; they become your words." Watch your words; they become your actions. Watch your actions; they become your habits. Watch your habits; they become your character. Watch your
Exactly.
character; it becomes your destiny.
Yeah.
And how true, how true
Mhm.
for us in New Thought, and it hits all of the things that we actually believe at our core of, like, yeah, how do we change ourselves? How do we change that belief system within ourselves that says, whatever it is, I'm not worthy, I'm not deserving of health, I'm not, all of these things. And so when we simply love ourselves, or when we put the tennis shoes on and go outside and are like, yes, I'm going to walk around my driveway and start there and continue building, because I want to be a healthy person, and I value health, and I know
Mhm.
how much that is. So beautiful. So we're talking about some of the core, and you talked about in your sharing, the four core values of modern, in our current world, and that was simplify, care, curiosity, and engagement. Why don't you talk
Yeah, so I
more
want
about
to be clear that I wouldn't necessarily call those the four core values for our modern world. I would just say those
that? Okay.
are there are many virtues that I think we can cultivate, and um that I those are the ones that I offered as especially important to become to be a good citizen of the planet, to be
Yeah.
uh to move into sort of responsibility and stewardship for this earth that we are part of. Um,
Yeah.
and it's not a complete list.
Yeah.
Um, I think we can
Good to know.
continue to, like, it's an open question. What are the virtues of planetary
Mm.
citizenship? Like, what are the new things that we need to focus more on than we have in the past? Like,
Mm.
they've all been around. Like, these aren't new,
Yeah.
um, but through history, the virtues that are required of us or that come to the forefront kind of change depending on circumstances and societies,
Mm.
and and they get subdivided differently based on different roles, like I talked about the masculine roles and feminine roles in societies where those are more kind of like clearly divided. Now we have the opportunity to really cultivate different virtues depending on our individual strengths. Something I'd suggest that everyone watching this do is go to the via character strengths inventory, and fill out the survey, and it'll show you what your virtues already are. Like, what are your strengths of character?
Mm.
Um, and that's another really valuable exercise, I think, for a men's group particularly, is to do each person do that and bring it in and kind of like reflect uh, reflect each other's virtues. Or even without doing that test, you can like go around the circle and each um, have the group focus on one man at a time and tell him what you see to be his virtues,
Mm.
his character strengths.
Yeah, that's a
Um,
beautiful
because we
exercise.
all tend to focus on where we're lacking, where are our growth edges,
Yeah.
but we forget, like, what are our strengths,
Yeah.
and then how can we bring those strengths to apply them to where we're weak, and how can we best use those strengths in the world.
Yeah. How do we leverage the strengths that we already have to be able to support us on that, and that in that growth edge, or in those challenging places where we're not quite where we want to be yet?
And I recognize your question was actually to talk more about those four that I mentioned. Um, so
Squirrel. Squirrel moment for us. Yeah, please
but
please go into those if
so
you want to.
simplicity is basically just about recognizing what's essential in life. Like, what is, and I think that virtue ethics also has something to offer us here, because the Stoics, who, Stoicism is really having a resurgence right now.
Yeah.
Um, and the core message of Stoicism is that the essential thing in life, the only truly essential ingredient to happiness and flourishing is virtue.
Mm.
It's what's within our control.
Mm.
And so focusing on being virtuous, acting according to these virtues of self-control, courage, justice, meaning, how do we treat other people? And wisdom, prudence, and the other, virtues, that we always have control over whether we act according to our values. And we don't have control over what happens. We don't have control over whether we get the result that we were hoping for. And that externals, the things that we think we're going to get, are ultimately not essential to our happiness. And the Stoics are kind of on the extreme end in terms of this, and they may not be totally right about that, but I think that they're more right about that than our modern culture of like, get more stuff.
Yeah.
Like
The
what
consumer.
you need in order to be happy is to buy the next thing, or drink the Coca-Cola, or like
Consumer society.
Yeah, exactly.
That we're currently in.
And I think most of us know that those things don't bring us lasting happiness.
Yeah, just bring us a sugar rush usually.
Yeah, like a sugar rush is not full human flourishing. It's like temporary, and usually it comes with a crash that you feel worse afterwards. And ultimately those aren't the fundamental essential things. So simplicity is about, and like, we have to recognize that consumerism is a huge part of what's fueling these ecological crises, because we keep turning nature, we keep turning living things into more stuff for us, or the places where living things live into places for us to go buy more stuff, and
or store more stuff.
Like, I have so much stuff, I need to have another place to put it besides my house that's already bigger than I need it to be. So yeah, that's simplicity. And care is really focusing on relationships, because I think that's one place where the Stoics didn't get it right, is that they, like, if you read Epictetus, who's one of the Stoics, who actually lived part of his life as a slave. So it's kind of powerful to read how he kind of really pared it down to what he felt was essential, and that when he was enslaved, that was ultimately not harmed. But like, there's a little bit of a, well, but what does that mean, that slavery is okay? And of course, I would say that it's not, and that also in his writings, he says that you should imagine your family dying and kind of not feel like you're attached to your family being alive in order to have that full, human happiness. And I think that goes a little bit too far. Yes, I think it's important to recognize that these things are contingent, and that you might lose everything, and that there is something in there that isn't harmed by that is your kind of divine essence. But also, we do need relationship in order to thrive as human beings. If you look at the attachment research, like, in order to be a fully flourishing, functional human being, you need that infant attachment with a caregiver. And we need relationships in order to thrive.
Yeah, and when we don't get it, then the attachment theories come in, and the different levels of oh, I didn't get that, and this was the effect of that. So I think being conscious of those pieces of the impact, right? The impact that care, that relationship, that and the influence that we have over other people, and especially over the young ones, to be able to nurture that best in them, instead of reinforcing maybe what we got, maybe what our parents got and passed down. And that's a higher call for us to be more conscious, be more aware. But I'm sorry, go ahead, Asa. You were talking about.
Yeah, so care is about recognizing that we already are embedded in a web of relationships, and we can't flourish alone. We flourish by fostering the flourishing of the people around us, and not just people, but all living things are part of the web that we exist within.
Yeah.
And we can't survive without a biosphere. We can't just turn it all into cool cars and then drive around in them and be happy. We have to, there has to be an ecosystem there.
Absolutely. And that awareness, I think more and more, more and less to a certain extent, we are more aware and less aware at the same time. There's paradox, of course, because we're human beings. So how do we step into the care and relationship for the world that we're literally is providing everything that we need to survive? The food, the water, the air, all of the fundamental essences for these 8 billion people. And then I think I heard something like a figure like there's actually 80 billion animals for us as consumers on the planet, like cows and chickens and pigs and the stuff.
Yeah, the largest biomass of animals is the ones that we're growing to eat.
We're growing to eat instead of the ones that are wild and running around in nature.
And that's another aspect of simplicity, is to think about how much meat do you really need to be healthy and flourishing as a human being. I actually heard a statistic that men are responsible for more greenhouse gases emissions than women. Part of that is because men feel like in order to be masculine, they have to eat meat.
Well, there's a belief, isn't it?
Truck. And some people do need to drive big trucks. I'm not knocking on people who drive big trucks. Some people need that for their livelihood, and that's fine. But if you're just driving the kids to school, then maybe you don't need a huge truck. You could get
a Prius or something.
Yeah, you can do something, or get an electric truck. There's some cool electric trucks out there.
Which brings us to curiosity. Or I'm sorry if you had more on that.
Yeah, no, totally. To project an image of masculinity, you have to do certain things where, as what we talked about is that the core of masculinity is really the virtues that make you a good, valuable member of your community in whatever roles you have in that community. Obviously, if you're a farmer, then you need a truck to do your work and contribute to society, and that's part of the virtue of what it takes to do that, to play that role,
to provide food for people. Absolutely. I like this. I like the next one about curiosity, because I think there isn't enough curiosity in our world, or I think there is enough curiosity, but there isn't enough curiosity that we nurture, or I can own it, that I nurture about other people and other things sometimes outside of my sphere of what I'm interested in, what I'm comfortable with, all of those things. Talk a little on that.
Yeah. So, as we try to solve these global problems, we run into the fact that we are not all the same. And there are a lot of differences among different groups of people that we still have to find some way to work with and work alongside and collaborate with, and even agree on goals. And so, the Paris Climate Accords of 2015 are an amazing step forward in that process of the whole world getting together and saying, yes, here's the goal. The goal is between 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming from pre-industrial levels. And in order to get there, we need to cut our emissions by 50% by 2030 and 100% by 2050 to get to net zero by 2050. Like, people that may, like the Paris Climate Accords aren't everything we need, but getting to that point of the whole world coming together and agreeing, this is the goal, this is the timeline, and each country has to pledge that we're going to do what we're going to do to get there. The question was about collaboration and about curiosity. And in order to kind of create that kind of agreement, we have to understand that we have differences and understand what those differences are and how we can work together and, give a little here, take a little there. And some of those differences are differences of values. Like, there are people in the world who believe things very differently than what we believe. And we could just assume, well, that's because they're wrong and I'm right. And that's what we tend to do especially in politics. We assume that my side is right and the other side is wrong. But that's not a very good ground to create real solutions that people can get on board with. So that's why I, talked about the virtue of curiosity, because, curiosity doesn't mean you have to agree, but it does mean try to understand where the other person is coming from and what, especially, like, here's a really good question. If somebody says something that you're like, that's BS, I don't agree with that. Like, that's, in fact, that means you're on the other side and I need to convince you that I'm right and you're wrong. And, that we all know how that usually ends up going. Rather than going down that road, ask, what led you to believe that? What experiences in your life led you to believe that? And you'll learn something about the person. Now, you still may not agree with them at the end of that conversation, but you've gotten closer to them. And you've gotten closer to being able to work with them to get somewhere that you both want to go.
The Socratic method, I think. Right?
Yeah. I mean, I learned this from Monica Guzman, who's a great person to follow if you're interested in building bridges with people you disagree with. And building bridges, again, doesn't mean agreeing, but it means that there's a bridge there that you can still communicate.
Yeah. And we talked about this before. It's moving from less of a competition model and more of a collaboration model, which is how we need to move. Like, the evolution of our world, the evolution of our society really dictates as we grow, as we become a society of laws instead of a society of power over. I can beat you, therefore you have to do what I say. No, the law says you can't do this. You might go to jail. Well, most people would go to jail. That was a little joke. But, this collaboration versus competition model really forces us into understanding, into that sense of curiosity and desire to understand, and why is it this way, and why do people believe that? And so digging deeper under than just the surface level of, like, I don't wanna, or I don't like it, or but what really is the drive there? As we
and not just why do people believe that, but why does this particular person that you care about believe that? And different people may have different journeys that lead them to their views, and they may have differences in views that you don't see because you're kind of outside of that. You kind of paint all the people on the other side with the same brush, and like, well, they all believe all these things for all these reasons that my side tells me is why they believe it. Usually I'm talking about politics right now, but like in politics, we have stories about why the other side believes what they believe, and usually it's for a stupid reason. But most people don't believe things for stupid reasons.
Yeah.
They have what at least they consider to be good reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And so, and then once you have that that understanding and that rapport as a human being, then people's minds do sometimes change. And it's not always the other person who changes their mind. Sometimes you actually learn something. It's like, oh, I never thought of it that way. Like, I never saw things from that angle. And now I can see that maybe there's some way I can enrich my own perspective.
Yeah. Those authentic.
And sometimes it's the other person that changes their mind, and then you get to be like, 1 point for my team. But I wouldn't go in hoping for that.
Yeah, absolutely. If that's your intention going into it, then we've lost the curiosity perspective, and we've gone into it with agenda.
Curiosity is also really valuable in relationships. Like, I'm married, and when I go into an argument, like, I want to prove why I'm right, I think everyone else can fill in the blank of what happens.
We all know how that one ends.
But when I go in with genuine curiosity, like, let me understand what my wife is experiencing and what she's thinking and what she's feeling, then it's usually a lot deeper and more complex and more intelligent than what I thought going in. And like, we might both have, we usually both do have a valid perspective and valid experiences that are informing where we're coming from. And then we can encompass both of those in the solution. Whereas if we go in with a right-wrong paradigm, then the best thing that can happen is that one person wins that argument and gets their way, and the other person goes away feeling resentful, and then that creates another conflict down the line.
Yeah. Great point. And so true. And that's where we can get engaged. That's where that curiosity can help us move into this other virtue of being engaged. How do we get engaged with life, with our partner, with our community, politically? On all these levels. And we're talking, I think, with these virtues, we were talking specifically on what could help, or what are some of the virtues that could help with dealing with the current situation in regards to climate. These
massive sort of environmental crises that are happening on a global scale, they feel kind of like, what can I do as an individual? Like, I'm just one person. We just need the governments to all get together and figure this out, or the corporations, and they have been really not very good at doing that so far. Although there are some policies that have really come in recently that are moving us in the right direction. So I don't want to say that like it's all doom and gloom. Like, a lot of large institutions are turning the ship around. It's just like, they're really big ships and it takes a while. And I think that the answer to that question is that actually that's true, that you as an individual don't have very much power, but we together do. And so I think an important sort of shift that we need to make, and that many people are making and have made, is from what can I do as an individual to what can I do as a member of the communities that I'm a part of. Whether it's your spiritual center, like what are your spiritual center's sustainability policies, and what can you do to move that in the right direction, or your town. Like, city councils are a lot more accessible than we maybe think. Like, you can go there and you can say your opinion, or and you can actually maybe have coffee with one of your city council members. Like, they are accessible to you. Cultivate relationships with those city council members, with those school board members, with the principal of your kid's school. But also, you don't have to do that alone. There are already groups that are working on whatever issue it is. There are groups that are working on it. And so join a group. Like, I attended a webinar with the authors of a really cool book called All We Can Save, Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson and Catherine Wilkinson.
Mm.
And they said the most important thing you can do is for climate change is to join something. You know,
Mm.
not everybody has to start their own nonprofit. There's already groups that are working on these things that have knowledge, collective knowledge that you can benefit from. And then you also get the benefit of having more community in your life. People talk about how our society in America, at least, has lost a lot of these third spaces, meaning it's not your work and it's not your home, but somewhere else where you interact with people. Now, if people are involved in a spiritual center of some kind, then that's a third space where you have community. But a lot of people don't have that, and I mean, I don't have that. I don't go to a center or anything like that, and so joining a group that cares about a cause that you care about is a great way to not only make a bigger difference than you can by yourself, but also have more of that community and relationship in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings us right back to, what do we value? What are we saying that we want to do in the world? What are our virtues, and how are we acting in accordance with those? I guess as men, we would call that, or as human beings, we would call that just being in integrity of like, this is what I value. This is what I want to support. Yeah. Powerful stuff, Asa, powerful stuff. I loved what you said. Virtues are the quality of character and reason. And Aristotle said that the activity of the soul with reason, that virtues are the activity of the soul with reason. I love that. So here we're talking about values, virtues, these different things, and I want to talk about something that might be a little controversial, and so stick with us. But the value of patriarchy, and I think going back to the history of patriarchy, and what was its original intention? How did it evolve? Kind of evolving out of, okay, I'm the strongest one in the group. I can defend the group from attack, whether it's a human, another person, or an animal, or whatever it is. And fast forward, and there were, of course, anything can be used for good or for bad, right? When we're interested in power then someone in charge, whether it's man or woman, but the person in charge is the person who can help guide that, who can help achieve the goal. Like there was a situation just last week, to bring it into our modern perspective, where this guy met me out. I was doing some work for his son's house, and he met me out there, and he's like, "Hello, I'm the patriarch of the family, proudly so." He's like, "I'm here looking after my kid, man. I think they spent too much money on the remodel of the kitchen and not enough money on the roof. I didn't want to make sure they're not going to have a roof leak, right?" And so I assured him, "Yeah, we're taking care of all the tuning up of the roof and making sure it's good and solid." But it just reminded me of the beautiful, aspects of patriarchy. When we think of all in this modern time, all the negative aspects, like how people have abused power, how that sense of male dominance has really taken over, and the control issues have taken over, and now it's about suppressing instead of listening to all the voices and having everyone in the community be heard and supported. Over time, it's been women or people of minority, people of different ethnicities that have been suppressed through that. So I get why we're where we are with it. But I think being able to see, like, oh, we want these ideas of being able to care for people and taking responsibility for the safety of our children, the well-being of our community, and these things. And we don't need to label it as patriarchal, but I think that from my perspective of like, yeah, I think my family was much more of a matriarchal. My mom was in charge. But that didn't exclude my dad in what he did. He was very much, they were roles people. So they were from, the silent generation. So, my dad would go to work every day, and that was his way of just loving us. And it was, he owned his own business, but it was kind of a monotonous and a similar same thing every day. And he was a smart guy. I know that he would have rather done some other things with his life. But he chose to sacrifice. He chose to provide for his family and to do the things that he wanted to do, or that he chose to do to take care of us. And I think there are some beautiful things of the value of a man taking responsibility, for us as men taking responsibility for certain things and saying, yeah, I'm going to be responsible for this. And how can I make sure that it's power with, whether it's power with my partner, whether it's power with my family, whether it's power with my community or with my nation or with my world, rather than power over. And I think that's where it goes awry, and where we got it wrong. Or where things went sideways, where it became that power over. Let me, instead of inquiring, this is the decision you need to make. You should do the roof instead of the kitchen, and I forbid you from doing the kitchen until you do the roof. That kind of control, that power over, rather than saying, hey, the roof is, if the roof leaks, everything under it's going to get ruined. Maybe it's more important to address the roof before remodeling the inside. So I just thought it was a beautiful experience.
That's kind of like a great metaphor, actually, the roof, because it's the container. It's the thing that protects everything else. And I think, obviously we're not saying that patriarchy is good. Like, we both believe that patriarchy is a bad thing. Like, we don't want to have one group having power over another group.
Which is what it is now.
Yeah, which is what patriarchy means. But when that man was talking about being the patriarch of the family, he was talking about the virtues of that particular role and that kind of social organization. Like, he's the one who's looking out for his community. And I think that this kind of comes in when we talk about masculinity and men's roles, and like, what should they be? And one concept that comes out a lot when people talk about that is this idea of toxic masculinity, which I think is pointing at something real. There are aspects of different forms of traditional masculinity that are toxic. There are ways that that's been perpetuated, like, saying, suck it up, don't be a pussy. Like, just that phrase, like, that female genitalia are the embodiment of weakness. Like, there's a whole lot that's like tied into those kind of phrases, or like, dude, that's so gay. Like, don't be like, and if you are gay, we're going to beat you up. Like, these are things that people have lived through. But it's not all of what traditional masculinity is. And I think this idea of virtue ethics also helps us to understand what's worth preserving and carrying forward from our traditional ideas of both masculinity and femininity. That these are masculinity, or our ideas of masculinity in its highest sense, are the collection of virtues that are necessary to fulfill a particular role. And that role might be the role of a patriarch, the role of the person who, looks out for, is looking out at the horizon, like, are there threats? My job is to make sure that the threats don't get in to where the more vulnerable members of the community are.
Yeah.
And that's an important virtue. Somebody needs to be doing that.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't have to be all men, I think. I think in our culture now, it doesn't have to be divided by gender. Like,
yeah, not anymore.
Women can be doing that, and some men can devote themselves to other things than that. We have a large enough society where we don't need every man to be ready to go fight a war at the drop of a hat.
Yeah.
We need so many different things. Like, we need things that our ancestors didn't need, like solar engineers, like people designing a better solar panel, right?
Yeah.
And that doesn't have to be a man or a woman. That could be anybody. And that's not something that our tribal ancestors needed. So I think there's a much more sort of personal choice in what qualities are we really going to hone to the highest degree. There's certain basic things that we all need. Like, we all need to be kind, and we all need to have a certain level of courage and self-control and compassion and all of these things. But we also have the opportunity to really pick some virtues that we want to cultivate to a really high level. And those, I think, it can be valuable to look at our traditions and what are the qualities that made a good man at any given particular point in time, and what qualities made a good woman. And we can draw from both of those. We don't have to pick one of those categories or the other. And there are also virtues that weren't as important then that are more important now. And like the 4 that we've talked about. Of course, those have always been important, but they're of particular importance in this moment in the 21st century. So I'll let you ask your last question.
Yeah. And I do want to say there is, and both of us have done a lot of rites of passages, especially with youth. So, there is that aspect that is missing from our society of being able to move from our young people from adolescence to young adulthood to full adulthood. And that is a process that is so necessary and so needed. I feel like right now, a lot of our, the younger men are feeling hopeless and disconnected, and Jungian psychology would say they're in that puer complex, or that childlike complex where they don't want to have cares, where they'd rather sit and play video games, where they don't want to get a job, where they don't want to engage the world, because it seems like a big, crazy, scary place. And yet there is also, the cynics, or the elder, the old man, who is, yes, this is what our society needs. And it's typically the elder that says, hey, you've been sitting on that couch long enough. It's time for a rite of passage. It's time for a change. It's time for you to say, okay, I've had enough. They used to call this time in the ashes, where young men would just sit around the fire, close to the fire, and even be in the ashes, and sometimes tend to the fire, but in tribal society. And so then they would take them, and they're like, okay, it's time for your rite of passage. It's time for you to grow up. You've had enough time there. And there's nothing in our society that's saying, hey, it's time for you to grow up. There's some things that are beckoning for us to do that would say, please, as a group, we need to mature. We have to get out of this adolescence that we seem to be stuck in to move into mature, healthy adulthood. But it seems like, the more and more or a lot of that can be, I want, I need. It can look like selfishness, versus how do I be of service? How do I give to others? A lot of these virtues that we've been talking about is about not only how I want to be in the world, but how I impact others. So I just wanted to speak to that for a minute. Thanks, Asa. Anything on that before we kind of move into my final question?
Yeah, I mean, I think that our culture, like I've spent a lot of my life on trying to create rites of passage for young men. And I think it's super important to mark that transition from childhood to adulthood. But also, one of the things that we're lacking now is a sense of what it is. What are they stepping into? Like, what does it mean to be a man for each individual kid? Like, to give them a chance to think into that, and what kind of man do I want to be? What kind of human being do I want to be? And again, I think virtue ethics is a great way to think about that we kind of lack in our society. Like, we talk about, what do you want to be when you grow up? Like me, and what we mean is, what do you want to do for work? And kids have dreams about like what they're going to accomplish, and how much money or fame they're going to have, or being, having the career they want to have, what success looks like. But what does it mean to just succeed at being human?
What a great question.
Yeah. And I think that's that virtue ethics is an answer to that question. Like, that's the question it's asking. And we can all look around and see lives that we're not the best kind of human life. What it takes to actually successfully be an adult human and live a good life and be a good man is not how much money is in your bank account. It's not how many followers you have on Instagram. It's not whether you make it in Hollywood or get the job you want. It's who you are as a human being. And that's attainable for all of us. All of us have the ability to be virtuous.
Yeah. Thanks, Asa. So I'd like to wrap us up today with the question that I've been asking is, what does healthy masculinity look like in the 21st century?
Well, the short answer is you should watch my talk for the summit. That's in the New Thought Men's Community membership site, because that whole talk is about this question. But the other short answer, because I have to go, is what it means to be a good man in the 21st century is to be the kind of man that meets the challenges of the 21st century. To look at what is demanded of us in this context, in this place and time. And the challenges of the 21st century, I think the biggest ones are these global environmental challenges. It's how do we live sustainably on a small planet with 8 billion people? How do we live our lives in a way that allows us to fully flourish as human beings, but also allows the rest of the planet to flourish? And the virtues we talked about are part of the answer to that question. But the other part is to really live into that question.
Yeah. Oh, Asa, thanks so much for being here today. Loved having you on the show, and we'll have you back many, many times. There's just so much that we could have gone into and discussed. We'd be here all day, though. So I want to say thank you, brother, so much for your sharing your wisdom today. And this wraps us up for today. So more to come. Stay tuned and stay tuned in.
All right. Thank you so much, Eamon.
I hope you enjoyed this interview from the New Thought Men's podcast. For instant access to all podcast interviews, talks from our summit, men's groups, and so much more, join us at newthoughtmens.community. Thanks so much for being with us today. There's more to come, so stay tuned in.